And today I'm going to share my experience being pregnant in the midst of a pandemic. Hi guys, welcome back to my channel. In case you're new here, my name is Margie. Feel free to subscribe before you leave. And today I'm going to share my experience being pregnant in the midst of a pandemic. And I would like to know how many of you experienced the same in the comment section. So feel free to add anything that you experienced that you would not have experienced if the pandemic was not there. Pregnancy on its own is a difficult journey. So you can imagine that now you are pregnant when the pandemic is happening or in the midst when it's just starting. So there are some things that when I share with people, they actually find it very different from the experiences, especially people who gave birth and were pregnant before, pre-COVID, before the pandemic. The experiences are very different. So the more I talk about it, the more I realize that my experience was actually very different being pregnant in the middle of a pandemic, and the pandemic is still there. So I hope that this video is going to probably relate with someone who's going through the same thing just because the pandemic is still there. The first thing that I experienced during pregnancy, just when COVID had hit, is extreme isolation. Now, I talk about extreme because isolation is one of the things that every human faced, because now you are limiting human interaction. You're not visiting your friends, you're not meeting up with family as often as you would. So now when I was pregnant, I was just 2 weeks pregnant, around 2 weeks, when now the pandemic was declared in Kenya. And it is now a different experience when now you are extra isolated, because now pregnant women became vulnerable. You're in the vulnerable group of people just because you're pregnant and there's a pandemic. So with that came extreme isolation from friends and from family. Now, what I mean is I could not just leave the house and go visit my friends. They could not just come as often as they would want. Like, the interaction for me was there, but it was more limited just because now I was a vulnerable person in their eyes. And I find that with the isolation now brings me to the second point. It brings up more anxiety, especially if you are an extrovert. Now, I like hanging out with people. I like being around people. And this meant that I had to stay home, and I was going through something very new. For those who know my story, I had had a miscarriage before the time now I had got pregnant, and so it took time. So being pregnant now in the pandemic and being isolated actually increased my anxiety levels, because you're very uncertain. Will I make it to the end? Pregnancy is just an uncertain journey. So I think that the anxiety levels that people who are pregnant actually face during this pandemic is higher, and especially when the pandemic was a foreign thing, like we didn't understand what was happening, then you become even more anxious because you're worried. Is my baby fine? Am I fine? And if I get COVID, then will my baby be fine? And all those things. It just, now couple that with all your pregnancy symptoms, spotting, for those who I had like another scare, couple it with nausea and extreme vomiting, your anxiety levels are actually bound to go up just because now you are pregnant and there is a pandemic. So I found that my anxiety levels were quite high, and I had to actually seek treatment for that post-birth, because that's when I actually noticed. My next point, which is, I don't know if it affects people in other countries, but with the pandemic came a curfew. Now, when the curfew was brought to Kenya, was imposed on Kenyans by the president, when it started, I think it was at 7 p.m. And that means that we were limited, especially the first days when the police were actually brutal. Your hospital visits cannot just be random unless you have a pass, unless you have a clinic book. Now, I was just a few weeks into the pregnancy. I actually didn't even have a clinic book at that time because my clinic visits were not even as many as they should have been probably. But with the curfew, I found that my movement was so limited, and I only could go to the hospital only if I could not persevere whatever I was going through. For me, a case in point was at around week 9-10, my nausea and vomiting got so bad that I remember one night I actually vomited at around 1 a.m. I vomited to a point I was feeling like I'm blacking out. And I remember feeling like I need to go to the hospital, but I'm also tired. But there is a curfew. Like, it was ringing in my head. I just can't freely walk out of the house because police in Kenya are just known to harass people. And I remember at that time there were even cases of pregnant women who were losing their babies or dying because they couldn't reach hospital just because of the curfew that had been put. So it became it's really stressful that you're pregnant and now you can just dash to the hospital when you need to calm yourself down and be assured that everything was okay. And I don't think that people who were pregnant pre-COVID would have had probably this experience, that you're limited by such things that have been put because of a pandemic. So it was not a pretty experience. Another instance where I actually felt the impact of the curfew is when I was having an appendix issue. So I didn't know that my appendix was about to explode, hence the emergency appendectomy that I later on had. I'll link that video. But when I was experiencing the pains that I was feeling, I kept calling my doctor because I just didn't want to go outside and be frustrated by the police to reach the hospital. So I used to call him so that I can know, is it so bad? Do I need to come? But I called him so many times that he actually said, I think you are in premature labor and need to come right to the hospital. It was so stressful that I had to always call my best friend who's a doctor. So she comes and we can move freely because she has a pass without police harassing us. I was privileged in that way to have her in my life and help me with such movements, and I thank her so much if she's watching this video. But it is not the same for everyone. Like, you're going to be frustrated by police just because of a curfew that has been imposed because of a pandemic, and yet you're pregnant. You just need to be reassured that everything is okay. Not to mention that labor does not announce when it's coming. So it's really a different experience when you are pregnant during a pandemic, because you can just move freely to hospitals. But later on, they tried to make sure that we have passes. Our clinic, like your clinic book, would act as your pass. But then I remember that day that I was rushed for my appendectomy and my stomach was still small, which is a problem that many people in the first trimester have, because you're being rushed to hospital because of pregnancy emergency and the police cannot see your stomach. So here in Kenya, it was just a bit more stressful. So when I was being taken to hospital after the appendectomy and I had like too much pain, so I needed to be rushed back to hospital, I remember the police stopped us. They were not actually in uniform, they're those people who patrol, but they stopped us and they were insisting, where is the letter from the chief? And I was like, how are you supposed to have a letter from the chief to reach the hospital in a pregnancy situation? And I remember I was mad and furious to a point they actually apologized after that. But there were so many cases, unfortunately, of women who lost their babies, women who lost their lives because of an imposed curfew without measures or exceptions. That is earlier on. I don't know how the situation has changed right now, but it's not a pleasant place to be when you're pregnant during a pandemic. Another experience that I noticed is the isolation. I've talked about it in point 1, but isolation from church for me is a big deal, or was a big deal when I was pregnant, because remember, we are now categorized as vulnerable people, and that meant that during the time of my pregnancy I would not attend physical church when physical church resumed. And even myself, I was not comfortable going to church at that point, because you're thinking of yourself, and most importantly, you're thinking of the baby. So I had no problem not going for physical church. But there's a thing about missing physical church for so long that it becomes detrimental to your spiritual life to a certain extent. It's not the same. Online church is good, but you miss the physical presence of people and just worshiping together and just being in church. It's another different kind of experience that I feel my experience being pregnant during a pandemic took away from me, because now after I had given birth, again, I'm still in the vulnerable sector of people because I have a small baby. How will I go to church with this baby? And for our church where we go, they're extremely strict about it. Vulnerable people, you are not allowed. Like, age limit is a thing, pregnancy is a thing, babies, they're not allowed even if physical church has resumed. So there's some sort of isolation that actually being pregnant during a pandemic has brought to me, like, especially in the spiritual aspect. And I find it a very big deal, because now I have to be very intentional about connecting with people, like online, attending virtual church and all. I'm just saying it's a good thing, but there's something you actually miss from attending the physical aspect of church that I actually miss. Another thing that I really looked forward to imagining of being pregnant is prenatal classes, Lamaze classes, pregnancy yoga, pregnancy dance classes. I really envisioned myself like being that woman who goes for those things. But because of a pandemic, all centers that actually offer such support to pregnant women were actually closed. It was so sad for me that I'm not going for pregnancy yoga. I think that's the one thing I really wanted. And I looked at hospitals asking, are you offering support classes like Lamaze classes? Most of them had stopped those classes. Most of them were online, which is not the experience when it's a physical class. And just because of the pandemic, these centers closed, and many pregnant women actually missed out on such support that you would otherwise get were it not be being a pandemic. And because of that, YouTube became like bae, because now all the information you want to do, YouTube. All the workouts I would have wanted to do, I just used YouTube. Actually, if you watch my pregnancy vlog, one of them, I was actually doing a pregnancy workout. Like, all those good things that just come with pregnant, I'm just from a pregnancy yoga class, all those became non-existent because you're pregnant in a pandemic and all those centers are just closed. So I feel like we really missed out a bit on the fun part, because of a pandemic. Another thing that stands out when you're pregnant in the midst of a pandemic is the hospital policies that are put in place are different from pre-COVID. For example, you'd have to do a COVID test before treatment is administered, and with pregnancy, it's almost like emergency situations that take you to hospital. Other than the prenatal clinics, sometimes you just go because of something is wrong and everything. And if, for example, for me, when I had to be done for the appendectomy, I had to do a COVID test before I was admitted. And even we didn't do intense treatment or intense tests until those results were out. So there were hospital policies that actually become not so pleasant for when you're pregnant in the midst of a pandemic, like those ones, like for tests. And even the hospital experience is totally different. I was surprised to know that during delivery in the past, you would go with your friends, 2 friends or something, and just be there with them for them to encourage you to keep laboring and all that. Pregnancy really deprived some of us of such support, and you find that most hospitals, one, you couldn't go with someone. In fact, when I was looking for the best hospital, I used to ask, do you allow someone in the room? Because it's my first time, I'm scared. I just want someone familiar to encourage me in this journey. So it was it was very disappointing that most hospitals actually, you don't you don't have a birth partner per se. Even doulas were not, like, if you had worked with a doula, you would not go all the way with them to hospitals during that pandemic, or your friend or your mom. It was not the same experience that you get to experience before COVID as a pregnant woman, and that a bit sucks a bit, especially if you're a first-time mom. Another hospital experience that I found so different is, of course, the staff have to also protect themselves. So you find, like, the whole gear when you're pregnant, and that's what your gyna is actually probably wearing, the COVID gear to protect themselves during prenatal visits. It takes away the personal approach that maybe a doctor would have had of with the patient, and it almost feels like robots. You become very robotic at some point, those prenatal visits, because it's just, I need to finish with this client and go to the next one and protect myself in the instance. I remember one time when the pandemic was getting serious, my gyna getting into the room for the ultrasound and the way they just check the baby, monitoring the baby, and he was in the full gear, and I was like, okay. And he was sprayed, like, the rooms, what happened, like, I just remember him being sprayed, washing hands. It took away the experience, because now you're like, all of you are just threats to the practitioner's health. So they have to take care of themselves, I understand, but it just takes that personal experience that you would otherwise have with a doctor during your consultation visits, and that was not interesting at all. Another thing that stands out when it comes to the hospital experience is the fact that when I gave birth, I don't know if this happened to any other person, I gave birth in a private hospital, but the bill had masks. I had masks. It's like every time I was being checked, perhaps when I was in labor, a mask was being billed. That escalates everything. Like, it's a small thing, but you can imagine a hospital stay. You've had a C-section and you stay there maybe for 4 days. How many people come to check on you? How many nurses visit the room? Or if you had a very intense and long labor, then how many times did the nurse or the doctor come in to check on you? How many masks are those in your bills? I found that very exorbitant for hospitals. I don't know if it's necessary. And on top of masks, of course, there are gloves also, which have to be disposed every time. I don't know if that's what happens pre-COVID, but I found that the bill during my experience being pregnant and during birth, just outrageous number of times that masks were in that bill for me. It was very not pleasing. Another thing that I experienced as a pregnant woman in the midst of a pandemic is that, of course, hospitals changed their policies. It's no visitors, and if you're lucky to go to a better hospital, there's one constant visitor. For example, like, they'd say, choose this person who will come to visit you. For example, Aga Khan, this person has to do a COVID test, then the COVID test results come out and they're negative, then they're free to visit you within the period that you're staying there. So the number of visitors was actually limited. I don't know if this is entirely a good thing, because when you have given birth, there's also another new level of fatigue that unlocks, and the constant visiting was a bother before, that many women were saying, I wish people would just let me rest. So it's a difference, because I think I would have wanted also my sisters to just freely come and visit me without having to beg, God, let's just see her. That familiar face, there's something it does to you. It encourages you, because hospital stays can become very depressing if you're not seeing anyone familiar. If you're used to your mom and you just want them to be coming, it's very depressing, you can imagine. So the hospital experience generally was a different one. So my last point when it comes to the difference between being pregnant pre-COVID and during COVID is visitors generally, even after the hospital experience, now you're home, generally you become very restrictive with visitors. As a parent of a newborn, of course, people limit visits because newborn needs to build immunity and you need to rest. But I think it's very important that you have a support system there with you. It's very important that someone just comes to check on you, help cook, help carry the baby as you rest. Such things go a long way for new moms. Now, during COVID, you become very, very cautious, because now it's not about your life only, it's about your babies. And once you become a mom, you become a bit protective. So you can imagine that now there's a virus that can be transmitted just by someone breathing. Something that would have been good as people coming and carrying your baby during I don't know what those functions are for kushika mtoto are called, but something that would have been a joyous moment was taken away. Like for new babies, you'd find that visitors were so restricted, and even if someone was carrying your baby, they were wearing a mask and they sanitized and everything. There's just the African experience of mothers, women coming to carry your baby and singing, that was taken away from, I feel like was taken away from us as pregnant women during a pandemic, because now these babies, we had to limit visitors and limit interaction and make sure that their immune system gets stronger, and by that, and they're not exposed to the virus. So I feel like right now, the babies being born during a pandemic, they've missed out on that. Okay, they don't remember, but as mothers, we've missed out on such supportive systems that were in place to encourage and celebrate you for having this baby. Generally, I would say I wish we got that more, but now we have to do it in very restricted settings, and at least even for mothers who are not uptight, I'd encourage you to allow someone to come and support you, even if you're very paranoid about the virus. So thank you so much for watching this video. I feel like I have talked so much about my experience. Please let me know about your experience, especially if you've had more than one baby and one was pre-COVID and one was during the pandemic. I'd like to know what differences stand out between the two experiences, because from my experience, pregnancy during a pandemic is way harder, and even postpartum, it's very difficult for the new parents who are out there. But one thing that I've learned is that humans adapt and we survive. So either way, I survived, and I'm so glad I managed to pull through. And if you enjoyed this video, make sure you subscribe, make sure you leave me a comment on what you think, and make sure you tell me about your experience, and make sure you share this video with someone who needs it. Thank you so much for watching, and see you on the next one.